When my daughter married, she announced to her husband, "This is your house now." Those words felt like a slap I never saw coming, shattering a lifetime of memories in an instant. The echo of her voice still haunts me every sleepless night. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in this same brick apartment building in Astoria, Queens, for 43 years. My husband Samuel and I moved here when we were young and hopeful, when the rent was affordable and the neighborhood felt like a small village within the endless sprawl of New York City. The walls of our home have absorbed decades of laughter, tears, arguments, and whispered dreams. They've witnessed my children's first steps, their graduation parties, and far too many lonely dinners after Samuel passed 3 years ago. Every morning, I wake to the familiar sounds of Roosevelt Avenue coming alive, the rumble of the number 7 train, the cheerful chatter of vendors setting up their fruit stands, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs mixing with the strong Turkish coffee I've learned to make just the way Samuel used to like it. I sit by my kitchen window, the same spot where I've watched my neighborhood change, where I've seen families grow and move away, where I've counted the seasons through the old oak tree in the courtyard below. My routine has become sacred to me in my solitude. I water the small potted herbs on my fire escape, I dust the photographs that line my mantelpiece, pictures of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school plays, and family vacations to Coney Island when money was tight but love was abundant. There's one photograph I cherish above all others, Samuel holding our newborn daughter Emma, his weathered hands so gentle, his eyes bright with the kind of joy that only comes from holding your child for the first time. But that particular morning in September, everything changed. I had been preparing for weeks, choosing the perfect navy blue dress from my closet, the one Emma had complimented years ago, saying it brought out my eyes. I had my hair done at the small salon on Northern Boulevard, where Mrs. Chen has been cutting it for the past 15 years. I even bought new earrings, small pearls that Samuel would have said made me look elegant. I wanted to look my best for my daughter's wedding day, wanted to be the proud mother beaming in the front row. The wedding was beautiful, I'll give her that. Emma looked radiant in her grandmother's lace dress, the same dress I had worn when I married Samuel 45 years earlier. The ceremony was held at a small church in Flushing, surrounded by white roses and the warm September light filtering through stained glass windows. I cried during the vows, remembering my own wedding day, feeling the phantom weight of Samuel's hand in mine. But something felt different. Throughout the ceremony, I noticed the cold distance in Emma's eyes when she looked my way. During the reception, I was seated at a table in the back, far from the wedding party, surrounded by distant relatives I barely recognized. When I tried to approach the head table to congratulate the newlyweds, Emma's new husband, David, barely acknowledged my presence. His handshake was brief and dismissive, his smile polite but empty. That's when I overheard it. Emma was talking to David's parents near the bar, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch those devastating words, "Don't worry about Mom's old apartment. This is your house now, David. We'll figure out what to do with her later." I felt my knees buckle slightly. The champagne glass in my hand trembled, and I had to set it down before I dropped it. The noise of the reception, the laughter, the music, the clinking glasses, suddenly felt muffled, as if I were underwater. I excused myself from my table and found a quiet corner near the coat check, where I could process what I had just heard. You see, the apartment Emma was referring to wasn't just any apartment. It was the home where she had grown up, where I had raised her and her younger brother Michael through scraped knees and broken hearts, through college applications and late-night talks about boys and dreams and fears. After Samuel died, Emma had convinced me to add her name to the deed, saying it would make things easier for estate planning. She said she wanted to make sure I would never have to worry about housing, that the apartment would always be my sanctuary. I had trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? She was my daughter, my firstborn, the little girl who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms and tell me I was the bravest mama in the whole world. But standing there in that reception hall, clutching my small purse with shaking hands, I realized that my sanctuary had been stolen from me with a signature on legal papers I hadn't fully understood. The apartment that held every meaningful memory of my marriage, my motherhood, my entire adult life, was now just a piece of property to be figured out, like an unwanted burden. I took a cab home that night instead of accepting the ride Emma had half-heartedly offered. During that long drive through the streets of Queens, past all the familiar landmarks of my life, I stared out the window and wondered when exactly my daughter had stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as an obstacle to be managed. The months following the wedding were a slow descent into a kind of emotional hell I had never experienced, not even during the darkest days of Samuel's illness. Emma's visits became fewer and more purposeful. She would arrive with her laptop and legal documents, talking about property values and market conditions, about how much money they could make if they sold the apartment and helped me find something more suitable for a woman your age. "Mom, you don't need all this space," she would say, gesturing around the living room where she had once played with her dolls, where we had celebrated her 16th birthday, where Samuel had taught her to play chess on rainy Sunday afternoons. "Think about how much easier your life would be in a nice senior community. You'd have people your own age to talk to. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this old place." But I knew what she really meant. She meant I was inconvenient. I was standing between her and a substantial amount of money that could fund the lifestyle she and David were building together. Money that could pay for their dream house in the suburbs, their expensive vacations, their plans for financial security. I began to notice how differently she spoke to me compared to how she spoke to David's family. When his mother called, Emma's voice would become warm and animated. She would ask about their health, their plans, their opinions on everything from restaurants to retirement investments. But when she spoke to me, her tone was practical, hurried, sometimes even annoyed, as if my very existence was an inconvenience she had to manage between more important tasks. The financial manipulation was subtle at first, but it became increasingly blatant. Emma would mention their mortgage payments in passing, how expensive it was to maintain two households, how helpful it would be if I could contribute more to the utilities and maintenance of our apartment. She started suggesting that I pay for family dinners when we went out, saying that since I had all this home equity just sitting there, it only made sense for me to pick up the check. I found myself saying yes to these requests more often than I should have, partly out of guilt and partly out of a desperate hope that my generosity might somehow restore the warmth that had disappeared from our relationship. I paid for birthday dinners, helped with their car payments, even contributed to their vacation fund, all while living on my modest Social Security check and the small pension Samuel had left me. But the money was never enough to buy back her love, and I was slowly learning that it never would be. The truly painful moments came in the silences and the forgotten occasions. My 72nd birthday passed without a phone call from Emma, though I saw on Facebook that she and David had spent that same day at a wine tasting in the Hamptons. When I came down with a severe case of bronchitis that winter and spent 4 days unable to get out of bed, I called her for help. She sent a grocery delivery service and told me to call my doctor if I got worse, but she never came to check on me herself. I started to pay attention to how she talked about other elderly people in her life. She would complain about David's grandmother, calling her demanding and out of touch when the old woman asked for help with technology or wanted to spend time with the family. She would roll her eyes when telling stories about older customers at her marketing job, imitating their voices and mocking their confusion about modern business practices. Slowly, I began to understand that in Emma's world, aging parents weren't people deserving respect and care. They were burdens to be managed as efficiently as possible while extracting maximum financial benefit. The breaking point came 8 months after the wedding. I had been feeling unwell for several days, experiencing chest pains that worried me enough to call Emma. She was busy with a work project and suggested I call an ambulance if I thought it was serious. I didn't want to be dramatic, so I took a cab to the emergency room at Mount Sinai, Queens, where I spent 6 hours alone, undergoing tests for what turned out to be severe anxiety manifesting as physical symptoms. While I was sitting in that sterile waiting room, wearing a thin hospital gown and wondering if anyone would even notice if something happened to me, I received a text message from Emma that changed everything. The message was clearly meant for David, but she had accidentally sent it to me instead. "Mom's having one of her episodes again. I swear she does this stuff for attention. Can we just move forward with the realtor consultation tomorrow?" I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over again until the words blurred through my tears. My chest pains, my fear, my desperate need for some human comfort from my own child, she saw it all as manipulation, as an inconvenience that was getting in the way of her plans to sell my home. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, surrounded by the silence of my empty apartment. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to truly examine the relationship I had with my daughter, to see it clearly without the rose-colored glasses of maternal love and hope. I realized that for the past several years, every conversation we had revolved around what I could do for her, what I could provide, how I could make her life easier. She never asked about my dreams, my fears, my memories, or my plans. She never inquired about my health unless she suspected it might interfere with something she needed from me. She never called just to chat, just to share a funny story or ask for advice about something that mattered to her. I had raised a daughter who saw me as a resource to be depleted, not a person to be loved. The next morning, I made my first act of rebellion. When Emma called to ask if I could lend her $2,000 for new furniture, I said something I had never said to her before. "No, Emma. I can't do that right now." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for what felt like an eternity. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp with disbelief. What do you mean you can't? You have money sitting in your savings account. You don't need it for anything important. I need it for my own security, I said, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it through the phone. I'm not comfortable depleting my savings right now. She hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't hear from her for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks of silence, I experienced something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I woke up each morning without the anxiety of wondering what Emma might need from me, what crisis she might present me with, what way she might find to make me feel guilty for not doing enough. I read books that I enjoyed, watched old movies that made me happy, and took long walks through my neighborhood without constantly checking my phone for her messages. I also did something I probably should have done years earlier. I made an appointment with a lawyer to understand exactly what rights I had regarding the apartment. What I learned was sobering but not hopeless. While Emma's name was indeed on the deed, as a joint owner I couldn't be forced to sell against my will. She couldn't evict me, and she couldn't sell the apartment without my signature. The lawyer, a kind woman named Patricia Rodriguez who specialized in elder law, explained that many families go through exactly what I was experiencing. She had seen countless cases of adult children who viewed their aging parents as financial opportunities rather than family members deserving respect and care. You have more power than you think you do, Patricia told me. But you have to be willing to use it. I also made another appointment that week, with a therapist named Dr. Sarah Kim who ran a support group for older adults dealing with family conflicts. I had never been to therapy before, but I was desperate to understand how I had allowed my relationship with my daughter to become so one-sided, so emotionally barren. In that first group session, held in a bright, comfortable room at the Queens Community Center, I met 6 other women and 2 men who were living through variations of my story. There was Margaret, whose son had moved back home after his divorce and treated her like an unpaid housekeeper while he rebuilt his life. There was Frank, whose daughter had convinced him to sign over his pension benefits and then barely spoke to him anymore. There was Rosa, whose grandchildren only visited when they needed money for college or cars or emergencies that never seemed to end. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in my pain. These people understood the specific heartbreak of loving someone who saw your love as weakness, your generosity as an endless resource to be tapped whenever convenient. Dr. Kim taught us about boundaries, a concept that felt foreign and almost selfish to me at first. I had been raised to believe that good mothers sacrifice everything for their children, that love meant saying yes to any request, no matter how it depleted you emotionally or financially. But Dr. Kim helped me understand that healthy love requires mutual respect, that relationships built on one-sided giving eventually collapse under the weight of resentment and exhaustion. She taught me that I could love Emma deeply while still protecting myself from being used and dismissed. Love without boundaries isn't love, she told us during one session that hit particularly close to home. It's emotional survival, and it's not sustainable for anyone involved. When Emma finally called after those 3 weeks of silence, her approach had changed. Instead of anger, she tried manipulation wrapped in concern. "Mom, I've been worried about you. You haven't seemed like yourself lately. David thinks maybe you should see a doctor about memory issues, forgetting to call us back, making strange financial decisions." The implication was clear: if I didn't return to my role as the compliant, generous mother, she would question my mental competency. It was a threat designed to terrify me into submission, and a few months earlier, it would have worked. But armed with new understanding from therapy and legal consultations, I responded differently. "Emma, I'm sharper than I've been in years. I'm finally paying attention to how I'm being treated, and I don't like what I see." She tried then to gaslight me, to convince me that I was imagining problems that didn't exist. "Mom, we're family. We love you. I don't understand why you're being so paranoid and difficult." But I had learned to recognize this pattern: the dismissal of my feelings, the reframing of my legitimate concerns as mental or emotional deficiency, the insistence that the problem was my perception rather than her behavior. "Emma," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "when was the last time you asked me about my life without wanting something from me? When did you last call just to chat, or invite me somewhere because you enjoyed my company, not because you needed me to pay for something?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She couldn't answer the question because she couldn't remember a single instance of treating me like a person she genuinely wanted to spend time with, rather than a resource she needed to manage. That conversation ended with Emma accusing me of being ungrateful for everything she had done for me, though when I asked her to be specific about what exactly she had done for me in recent years, she couldn't provide examples beyond "caring about you" and "trying to help you make good decisions." I realized that in Emma's mind, her willingness to accept my money and make decisions about my life constituted generous care on her part. She genuinely seemed to believe that allowing me to fund her lifestyle was a favor she was doing for me, not the other way around. The holidays that year were a turning point. For Thanksgiving, Emma invited me to dinner at her new house in Westchester, the house that had been partially funded by the money I had given her over the past year. But the invitation came with conditions. I needed to bring specific expensive dishes from particular restaurants, contribute $100 toward the wine budget, and limit my stay to 4 hours because they had other plans afterward. I almost said yes, because the alternative was spending Thanksgiving alone, something that felt too sad and pathetic to bear. But Dr. Kim had prepared us for exactly this kind of moment in our support group sessions. The question isn't whether you'll be alone, she had said. The question is whether you'll be lonely. You can be lonely in a room full of people who don't see you, or you can be peacefully alone while you figure out how to build relationships with people who actually care about you. So I declined Emma's conditional invitation and instead made plans with my neighbor Mrs. Martinez, whose family had invited both of us to their warm, chaotic, genuinely welcoming celebration. I brought a bottle of wine and my grandmother's famous sweet potato recipe, and for the first time in years, I felt like a valued guest rather than an obligation someone was reluctantly fulfilling. That evening, surrounded by the Martinez family's laughter and genuine interest in my stories about old New York, I realized how much I had forgotten about what it felt like to be appreciated simply for being myself. Emma's response to my absence was swift and punitive. She called me the next morning, furious that I had chosen strangers over family, and demanding to know what was wrong with me. When I tried to explain that I had felt more welcomed and respected at the Martinez table than I had at any family gathering in recent years, she accused me of being dramatic and attention-seeking. "You're becoming one of those bitter old women who pushes everyone away," she said, her voice cold with disdain. "You're going to end up alone, and it's going to be your own fault." The threat was unmistakable: behave the way I want you to behave, or lose your family entirely. For a moment, the old fear gripped me. The terror of abandonment, of growing old without any connection to my children, almost made me apologize and beg for forgiveness. But then I thought about the warmth in Mrs. Martinez's kitchen, the genuine interest her teenage granddaughter had shown in my stories about Queens in the 1970s, the way her son had insisted I take home leftover turkey and promised to check on me during the week. I thought about my support group friends, who called me just to chat, who remembered details about my life and asked follow-up questions about things that mattered to me. I thought about my lawyer Patricia, who treated me with respect and helped me understand my rights. I thought about Dr. Kim, who had taught me that I deserved relationships based on mutual care and respect. "Emma," I said slowly, "I'm not pushing my family away. I'm finally learning to recognize the difference between people who love me and people who use me. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why." She hung up on me, and I didn't hear from her again until after Christmas. During that period of silence, I made some important changes in my life. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, one that Emma had no access to or knowledge of. I transferred most of my savings there, leaving only enough in our joint account to cover my basic bills. I also changed the locks on my apartment, something that was within my rights as a joint owner of the property. I started volunteering at the local senior center, helping with their literacy program for older immigrants who were learning English. The work was rewarding and meaningful, and it connected me with a community of people who valued wisdom and experience rather than seeing age as a liability. I also began to rebuild my social life. I joined a book club at the public library, started taking a watercolor painting class at the community college, and became a regular at the morning walking group that met in Flushing Meadows Park. For the first time in years, I had friendships that weren't based on what I could provide for other people. My therapist helped me process the grief I felt about losing the daughter I thought I had. Because that's what it was, grief. I was mourning the loss of a relationship that I now realized had been mostly fantasy on my part. The loving, grateful daughter I had imagined I was supporting didn't actually exist. The real Emma saw me as a convenience, not a person. But I was also discovering parts of myself I had forgotten existed. I was funnier than I remembered, more interesting, more capable of forming new relationships. Without the constant drain of Emma's demands and criticism, I had energy for things I genuinely enjoyed. The confrontation I had been both dreading and anticipating finally came in January. Emma showed up at my apartment unannounced, using the key she didn't know I had changed. When she couldn't get in, she pounded on my door and shouted through the hallway, creating enough of a scene that several neighbors came out to see what was happening. I opened the door calmly and invited her inside, not because I wanted to continue our destructive pattern, but because I was ready to end it definitively. "You changed the locks," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you lock me out of my own property?" "It's my home, Emma," I replied steadily. "And you don't live here. If you want to visit, you need to call first, like any other guest would do." She tried several different tactics during the hour she spent in my apartment that day. First came the emotional manipulation, tears about how much she missed me, how worried she and David had been, how family should never shut each other out the way I was shutting them out. When that didn't work, she tried guilt, reminders of everything she claimed to have done for me over the years, accusations that I was being selfish and ungrateful, suggestions that I was having mental health issues that were making me paranoid and hostile. Then came the financial threats, implied suggestions that she might have me declared incompetent, warnings about what would happen to me if something happened and I had no family to take care of me, reminders about how much money the apartment was worth and how foolish I was being by not selling it. But I had prepared for all of these approaches through months of therapy and legal consultations. I knew my rights, I understood the manipulation tactics, and I had built a support system that gave me the strength to resist Emma's attempts to drag me back into our toxic dynamic. "Emma," I said when she finally paused in her litany of accusations and demands, "I want to show you something." I walked to my bedroom and returned with a cardboard box I had been filling over the past few months. Inside were photographs, letters, greeting cards, and mementos from Emma's childhood and young adulthood. Pictures of birthday parties I had thrown for her, cards she had made me for Mother's Day, letters she had written from college thanking me for my support and telling me how much she loved me. "This is the daughter I raised," I said, placing the box on the coffee table between us. "This is the little girl who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms and tell me I was the bravest mama in the world. This is the teenager who wrote me letters saying I was her hero and her best friend." Emma's face softened slightly as she looked at the photographs, and for a moment, I thought I might be reaching the person she used to be. "I don't know when that daughter disappeared," I continued. "I don't know when she was replaced by someone who sees me as nothing more than a source of money and a problem to be managed. But I can't keep pretending that the person sitting in front of me right now is the same person who wrote me this card." I pulled out a Mother's Day card from her junior year of college, one where she had written a long note about how grateful she was for all my sacrifices, how much she admired my strength, how lucky she felt to have a mother who loved her so unconditionally. "I loved that daughter with everything I had," I said, my voice steady despite the tears running down my cheeks. "I gave her everything I could give, my time, my energy, my money, my hopes, my dreams. I would have done anything for her, and I thought she knew that." Emma was looking at the card, and I could see something flickering in her eyes, maybe recognition, maybe regret, maybe just the memory of who she used to be before resentment and greed replaced love and gratitude. "But the woman sitting in front of me now doesn't love me," I continued. "She tolerates me as long as I'm useful, and she resents me when I'm not. She calls me demanding when I need help, paranoid when I protect myself, and ungrateful when I finally stop giving her everything she asks for." I took the card gently from Emma's hands and placed it back in the box. "I can't keep loving someone who doesn't exist anymore," I said. "I can't keep giving to someone who only takes. I can't keep hoping that if I sacrifice just a little bit more, if I give just a little bit more, if I ask for just a little bit less, somehow the daughter I raised will come back." Emma was crying now, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of recognition and remorse or just frustration at losing control of the situation. "I need you to decide who you want to be in my life," I told her. "If you want to be my daughter, really be my daughter, not just play the role when you need something from me, then we can work on rebuilding a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine care." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I had watched Emma learn to ride a bicycle, where I had waited for her to come home from school, where I had worried about her during her teenage years and celebrated her achievements as a young adult. "But if you just want to keep me around as a resource to be managed, as someone who pays for things and then gets pushed aside until you need something else, then I can't do that anymore," I said without turning around. "I won't do that anymore." When I turned back to face her, Emma was staring at the box of memories with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I held on to hope that this conversation might be the beginning of something different between us, that seeing tangible evidence of the love we used to share might remind her of what she was throwing away. "Mom," she said finally, and her voice was softer than it had been in years. "I didn't realize." But then she seemed to catch herself, and the vulnerability disappeared from her face. "I didn't realize you were keeping score of everything," she said, her tone shifting back to the cold defensiveness I had become accustomed to. "I didn't know you were going to use my childhood letters against me someday." It was exactly the wrong response, but it was also exactly the response I had learned to expect from the person Emma had become. Instead of seeing herself in those letters and cards, instead of being reminded of the capacity for love and gratitude she used to have, she saw them as weapons I was using to manipulate her. "I'm not using them against you, Emma," I said sadly. "I'm using them to remind myself of why I loved you so much, and why losing that love has been so devastating." She left without saying goodbye, taking the box of memories with her. I never saw it again, and I suspect she threw it away. The physical reminders of our former relationship were apparently too painful or too inconvenient for her to keep. But something important had shifted during that conversation. For the first time in years, I had been completely honest about what our relationship had become and what it was costing me. I had stopped pretending that Emma's behavior was acceptable just because she was my daughter. I had stopped making excuses for her lack of caring, her endless demands, her casual cruelty disguised as practical concern. I had also finally accepted that the daughter I had raised was gone, and no amount of hoping or giving or sacrificing on my part was going to bring her back. The weeks following our confrontation brought a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Initially, the silence from Emma felt ominous. I kept expecting angry phone calls, legal threats, or some other form of retaliation. But as days turned into weeks without contact, I began to appreciate the quiet space her absence created in my life. I no longer woke up each morning wondering what crisis Emma might present me with, what financial emergency would require my immediate attention, what way she might find to make me feel guilty for not doing enough. Instead, I woke up with a sense of possibility, with energy for the activities and relationships that brought me genuine joy. My painting class became a highlight of my week. I discovered I had a natural eye for color and composition, something I never would have learned if I had continued spending all my emotional energy managing Emma's needs and demands. The instructor, a patient woman named Carol who was about my age, encouraged me to experiment with abstract expressionism, saying my paintings captured emotion in ways that purely realistic work sometimes missed. "You paint like someone who has lived through something significant," Carol told me one afternoon as I worked on a canvas filled with swirling blues and grays, colors that somehow captured the feeling of emerging from a long, dark period into clearer light. I also deepened my friendships with the people I had met through various activities. Mrs. Martinez and I began meeting for coffee every Tuesday morning, sharing stories about our families and our respective journeys through widowhood and aging. She had her own complicated relationship with one of her sons, and we found comfort in discussing the universal challenge of loving adult children who don't always love you back in healthy ways. My book club became another source of intellectual stimulation and social connection. We read everything from classic literature to contemporary memoirs, and I discovered that my perspective as an older woman brought valuable insights to our discussions. The younger members of the group would often ask for my thoughts on how historical events had shaped the characters in the books we read, treating my life experience as wisdom rather than irrelevance. For the first time in years, I felt valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. I continued working with Dr. Kim, both in individual sessions and in the support group. The other members and I had become genuinely fond of each other, celebrating each other's victories and providing comfort during setbacks. When Margaret finally set boundaries with her manipulative son, we threw her a small party at the community center. When Frank reconnected with an old friend from his military service days, we all listened to his stories about their adventures with genuine interest and enthusiasm. Dr. Kim helped me process the complex grief I felt about my relationship with Emma. It was, she explained, a form of disenfranchised grief, mourning the loss of someone who was still alive but no longer emotionally available to me. Society doesn't really have rituals or support systems for this kind of loss, which can make it feel particularly isolating and confusing. "You're not just grieving the relationship you had with Emma," Dr. Kim explained during one of our sessions. "You're also grieving the relationship you hoped to have with her, the future you had imagined sharing with her, and the version of yourself that existed in that relationship." This insight helped me understand why the loss felt so profound and multifaceted. I wasn't just missing my daughter, I was missing the role of devoted mother that had defined so much of my identity for decades. I was having to learn how to be myself outside of that relationship, how to find meaning and purpose that didn't depend on Emma's approval or need for my help. But I was also discovering that this process of redefinition, while painful, was ultimately liberating. For too many years, my sense of self-worth had been entirely dependent on how useful I could be to my children, particularly Emma. When she needed me, I felt valuable. When she dismissed me, I felt worthless. Now I was learning to find value in my own interests, accomplishments, and relationships. I was good at painting, I was an insightful book club member, I was a trusted friend, I was a helpful volunteer. These identities weren't dependent on anyone else's approval or need for my services. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected opportunity. The senior center where I volunteered was organizing a group trip to Washington, D.C. to visit the museums and monuments. I had never traveled anywhere by myself since Samuel died, and the idea both excited and terrified me. In the past, I would have asked Emma's permission before making such plans. I would have worried about whether she might need me for something during the dates I would be away, whether she would be upset about the money I was spending on myself instead of saving it for her future needs. But this time, I simply signed up for the trip and started planning what I wanted to see and do. I was particularly excited about visiting the National Gallery, where I could see masterpieces by artists whose techniques I was studying in my painting class. The trip was wonderful. I shared a room with Margaret from my support group, and we stayed up late talking about art and history and the unexpected adventures available to women our age when we stopped limiting ourselves to what others expected of us. I took dozens of photographs, not to show anyone else but simply to help me remember the beauty and satisfaction of exploring something new. When I returned to Queens, energized and full of stories about my adventures, I found several voicemail messages from Emma. They started out concerned. She had apparently tried to reach me and been worried when I didn't answer. But they quickly escalated to annoyance and then anger as she realized I had been traveling without informing her of my plans. "Mom, you can't just disappear like that," the final message said. "What if something had happened to you? What if there had been an emergency? You need to start thinking about other people, not just yourself." The accusation stung, particularly the suggestion that I was being selfish. For decades, I had thought about other people, primarily Emma, more than I had thought about myself. I had made decisions based on what my children needed, wanted, or might find convenient. I had sacrificed my own interests, postponed my own dreams, and depleted my own resources in service of their happiness and success. But I was beginning to understand that in Emma's mind, any action I took that didn't center her needs and convenience was inherently selfish. My independence threatened her sense of control over my life and resources. I didn't call her back immediately. Instead, I spent a few days processing my feelings with Dr. Kim and my support group friends. They helped me recognize that Emma's anger about my trip was really anger about losing the ability to monitor and manage my activities. When I did finally return Emma's call, I was calm and direct. I went to Washington, D.C. with a group from the Senior Center. I had a wonderful time, and I'm looking forward to planning more trips. "You should have told me," Emma insisted. I was worried sick. I even called the police to do a wellness check. I felt a flash of anger at this revelation. Emma hadn't spoken to me in months, had shown no interest in my daily life or emotional well-being, but she had called the police when I didn't answer her calls for a few days. It felt like an invasion of privacy disguised as concern, a way of asserting control over my life even when she wasn't actively participating in it. "Emma, I'm a competent adult who doesn't need to clear her travel plans with anyone," I said firmly. "I'm sorry you were worried, but I'm not sorry I took the trip." The conversation that followed was depressingly familiar. Emma accused me of being stubborn and inconsiderate. She suggested that my independence was really just disguised selfishness, that I was becoming one of those difficult old women who make life hard for everyone around them. But her words no longer had the power to devastate me the way they once had. I had spent months building a life that gave me joy and purpose independent of Emma's approval. I had surrounded myself with people who valued my company, respected my autonomy, and celebrated my growth rather than feeling threatened by it. "Emma," I said when she paused in her litany of complaints, "I hope someday you'll be happy that your mother is healthy enough and financially secure enough to travel and try new things. I hope someday you'll want to hear about my adventures because you care about my happiness, not because you need to monitor my activities." "I do care about your happiness," she protested, but there was something hollow in her voice, as if she was saying words she thought she should say rather than expressing genuine feeling. "Then prove it," I said gently. "Call me sometime just to ask how I'm doing, not because you need something or want to give me advice about how I should be living differently. Send me a card on my birthday without it being a request for money or a lecture about my responsibilities. Ask me about my painting classes or my book club because you're interested in what I'm learning, not because you're looking for evidence that I'm wasting money or time." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Emma couldn't imagine relating to me in any of the ways I had described, because she had never thought of me as a person with interests and experiences worth caring about for their own sake. That conversation ended the way most of our recent conversations had ended, with Emma hanging up in frustration and me sitting quietly in my apartment, sad but no longer devastated by her inability to love me the way I had loved her. Summer brought new possibilities and new challenges. I had signed up for an intermediate painting class and was working on a series of canvases inspired by my memories of Queens in the 1970s and 80s. The paintings were a way of honoring my life with Samuel and my early years as a mother, capturing the beauty and meaning of experiences that Emma seemed to view as irrelevant ancient history. I was also spending more time with my grandchildren, Emma's 2 children and Michael's daughter. These relationships required delicate navigation, since I didn't want to put the children in the middle of my conflict with their parents, but I also didn't want to lose connection with them entirely. Michael, my younger child, had remained mostly neutral during my disputes with Emma, which I understood but found disappointing. He loved his sister and didn't want to take sides, but his refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of my grievances felt like a form of abandonment in itself. Still, he was more open to maintaining a relationship than Emma was, and he didn't object when I invited my granddaughter Sarah for occasional outings. Sarah was 16, old enough to understand that adult relationships are complicated, and I treasured our afternoons together exploring museums or walking through different neighborhoods in Queens. During one of these outings, Sarah surprised me by bringing up the family tensions directly. "Grandma, Mom says you're being really difficult lately. She says you're not the same person you used to be." I considered how to respond honestly without burdening Sarah with adult problems that weren't her responsibility to solve. "I think your mom is right that I'm not the same person I used to be," I said finally. "I used to say yes to everything anyone in the family asked of me, even when it was hard for me to manage. Now I sometimes say no when I need to take care of myself. Some people find that change difficult to accept." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. At 16, she was beginning to grapple with her own questions about independence and boundaries, and I could see her processing my words in the context of her own experiences with family expectations. "Do you think it's okay for people to change?" she asked. "I think it's necessary," I replied. "I think we're supposed to keep learning and growing throughout our whole lives. If I'm exactly the same person at 72 that I was at 32, that probably means I stopped paying attention somewhere along the way." These conversations with Sarah gave me hope that the next generation might understand something about respect and autonomy that Emma seemed to have missed. But they also reminded me of what I was potentially losing by insisting on boundaries with Emma: access to my grandchildren, participation in family celebrations, the comfort of belonging to something larger than myself. The temptation to give in, to return to my old patterns of compliance and self-sacrifice, was constant. It would have been so much easier to apologize for being difficult, to resume my role as the family's financial and emotional resource, to accept that being used was better than being alone. But every time I wavered, I remembered the peace I had felt during those weeks when Emma wasn't speaking to me. I remembered the satisfaction of discovering new talents and interests, the joy of friendships based on mutual respect, the relief of waking up without anxiety about what someone might demand of me that day. I also thought about the other women in my support group, who had found the courage to set boundaries with their own difficult adult children. Margaret's relationship with her son had actually improved after she stopped enabling his irresponsible behavior. He was more respectful now that he couldn't take her support for granted. Rosa had discovered that her grandchildren enjoyed spending time with her more when their visits weren't contingent on her providing money for various expenses. Dr. Kim had warned us that family members often escalate their manipulative behavior when their usual tactics stop working. She called it an extinction burst, a final, intense attempt to restore old patterns before either giving up or adapting to new ones. I should have been prepared when Emma's extinction burst arrived in the form of a registered letter from a law firm, but the shock still took my breath away. The letter informed me that Emma was petitioning the court to have me declared incompetent due to erratic behavior, poor judgment, and signs of cognitive decline that pose a risk to her financial and physical safety. As evidence, the letter cited my sudden personality changes, my refusal to maintain family relationships, my impulsive spending on unnecessary travel, and my paranoid accusations against family members who are trying to help her. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that letter for a long time, feeling the familiar knot of fear and anxiety tightening in my chest. This was Emma's nuclear option. If she couldn't manipulate me back into compliance, she would try to have me legally declared incompetent so she could control my decisions and finances directly. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Emma was willing to publicly claim that her mother was mentally incapacitated, to drag me through legal proceedings that would be humiliating and expensive, to risk destroying what remained of our relationship entirely, all because I had finally learned to say no to her unreasonable demands. But alongside the hurt and fear, I felt something else, a cold, clear anger that burned away the last of my guilt about setting boundaries with my daughter. Anyone who would use the legal system to attack their mother's autonomy and dignity was not someone who deserved unlimited access to my love, energy, and resources. I called Patricia Rodriguez, my lawyer, and made an appointment for the next day. Patricia was outraged when she read Emma's petition. "This is elder abuse," she said flatly. "Your daughter is using the court system to intimidate and control you. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." Patricia explained that competency hearings require substantial evidence of cognitive impairment, and that Emma's petition was full of allegations that actually demonstrated my competence rather than undermining it. Taking art classes, planning trips, managing my finances independently, setting boundaries in relationships, these were all signs of a healthy, functioning adult, not someone who needed a guardian. We spent the next several weeks preparing for the hearing, gathering evidence of my mental acuity and independent functioning. My doctor provided a letter confirming that I showed no signs of dementia or other cognitive impairment. Carol from my art class wrote a statement about my creative growth and intellectual engagement. Dr. Kim provided professional testimony about my mental health and emotional stability. The hearing itself was as awful as I had anticipated. Emma sat across the courtroom from me with her lawyer, avoiding eye contact but occasionally dabbing at her eyes with tissues as if she were the victim in this situation. She testified about her concerns for my well-being, painting a picture of a confused, stubborn old woman who was making dangerous decisions and pushing away family members who were trying to help. Listening to Emma describe me to a judge in a courtroom full of strangers as mentally incompetent was one of the most painful experiences of my life. This was my daughter, the little girl I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, publicly arguing that I was too mentally deficient to control my own life. But when it was my turn to testify, I found my voice. I spoke clearly and calmly about my life, my activities, my relationships, my financial management, and my reasons for setting boundaries with Emma. I explained how her constant demands and lack of reciprocal care had affected my mental health, and how much better I felt since I had started prioritizing my own well-being. Patricia presented evidence of my competence methodically and thoroughly. Bank records showing responsible financial management, medical records confirming good physical and mental health, testimonies from friends, teachers, doctors, and therapists attesting to my intelligence, judgment, and emotional stability. The judge dismissed Emma's petition decisively and sternly, noting that there was no credible evidence of incompetence and warning that frivolous competency petitions constitute a form of elder abuse that the court takes seriously. As we left the courtroom, Emma finally looked at me directly for the first time that day. I saw something in her eyes that might have been shame or regret, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar hardness I had learned to recognize as her default expression when dealing with me. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the cruelty of what she had tried to do to me. Instead, she walked out of that courthouse and out of my life without saying a word. The months that followed the competency hearing were a period of profound healing and growth for me. The legal victory had confirmed what I already knew intellectually, that I was a competent, capable adult who deserved to make my own decisions about my life. But seeing that confirmed in a court of law, with objective evidence and professional testimony, helped heal something deeper. Emma's attempt to have me declared incompetent had been the ultimate expression of her view that I existed primarily to serve her needs and preferences. When I stopped fulfilling that role, she had tried to use the legal system to force me back into compliance. The failure of that strategy represented more than just a legal victory, it was a definitive rejection of the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for far too long. I continued with my art classes and was invited to display some of my paintings in a small group show at the community center. The opening reception was attended by many of the people who had become important parts of my new life, friends from book club, fellow volunteers from the senior center, members of my support group, neighbors who had shown me genuine kindness. Standing in front of my paintings, surrounded by people who appreciated my work and valued my company, I felt a sense of accomplishment and belonging that had nothing to do with my role as anyone's mother or grandmother or source of financial support. I was simply myself, an artist, a friend, a community member, and that was enough. Michael attended the reception with Sarah, and we had a pleasant evening together. He had been shaken by Emma's legal action against me, and while he still avoided taking sides directly, he had made more of an effort to maintain an independent relationship with me. Sarah was particularly enthusiastic about my paintings, asking thoughtful questions about my techniques and inspiration. "Grandma, I had no idea you were so talented," she said, studying a canvas I had painted of the view from my apartment window, capturing the layers of life and history visible from that single vantage point. "Neither did I admitted. I never had time to find out when I was younger. I was too busy taking care of everyone else." Sarah nodded with the kind of understanding that surprised me in someone so young. "Do you think I should learn to paint too?" she asked. "I think you should learn what makes you happy," I replied. "And I think you should protect time and space for those things, even when other people want you to do something different." It was a lesson I wished I had learned decades earlier, but I was grateful to be able to pass it on to my granddaughter. The winter of that year brought an unexpected development. I received a Christmas card from Emma, the first communication I'd had from her since the courthouse. The card was generic, the kind you buy in a pack at the drugstore, with no personal message beyond, "From Emma and David." I stared at that card for a long time, trying to decide how to interpret it. Was it an olive branch? An attempt to maintain minimal contact without actually apologizing or changing? A way of assuaging guilt about the competency hearing? I decided it didn't matter what Emma's motivation was. What mattered was how I chose to respond, if at all. After several days of consideration, I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in returning to a relationship characterized by superficial pleasantries while deeper issues remained unaddressed. But I kept the card, placing it in the drawer with other mementos from my life with Emma. Not because I thought it represented progress or hope, but because it was part of the story, part of the complicated reality of loving someone who couldn't or wouldn't love me back in healthy ways. By spring, I had been living my new life for more than a year. The changes were evident in ways both large and small. My apartment felt more peaceful, decorated with my own paintings and filled with books I was actually reading rather than storing. My calendar was full of activities I had chosen because they brought me joy or growth or connection with people I cared about. I had also made a major financial decision. I sold some stock investments Samuel had left me and used the money to take a month-long painting workshop in Santa Fe. It was exactly the kind of impulsive spending that Emma had cited as evidence of my incompetence, but it was actually one of the most thoughtful decisions I had made in years. The workshop was transformative. I spent 4 weeks focused entirely on developing my artistic skills, surrounded by other older adults who had decided that it was never too late to pursue dreams they had deferred during the busy middle years of their lives. The intensity of creative work, combined with the stunning landscape of New Mexico, produced some of the best paintings I had ever created. More importantly, the experience confirmed something I had been gradually learning, that I was capable of much more than I had ever allowed myself to explore. For too many years, I had defined myself primarily in relation to other people's needs. Wife, mother, caretaker, supporter, these were all important roles, but they weren't the entirety of who I was or who I could become. When I returned to Queens in late spring, energized and excited about continuing my artistic development, I found a letter waiting for me from Emma. Not a generic greeting card this time, but an actual letter, several pages of handwritten text that had clearly taken time and thought to compose. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my kitchen window to read it, preparing myself for whatever emotions it might trigger. Dear Mom, the letter began. I've been thinking a lot about our relationship over the past year, and I realize there are things I need to say to you. The letter that followed was not the apology I had once hoped for, but it was perhaps something more valuable, an honest acknowledgement of the dynamics that had damaged our relationship. Emma wrote about the pressure she had felt as my oldest child to be responsible for my well-being after Samuel died. She described feeling overwhelmed by what she perceived as my needs and expectations, and how she had dealt with that overwhelm by trying to control and manage my life rather than simply supporting me. She admitted that somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing me as a person with my own desires and capabilities, and had started seeing me as a problem to be solved or a resource to be managed. She acknowledged that her financial requests had been unfair and her dismissal of my feelings had been unkind. I don't know how to fix what I've broken, the letter concluded. I don't know if you can forgive me for the competency hearing or for all the ways I failed to see and appreciate who you are. But I want you to know that I've been watching from a distance as you've built this new life for yourself, and I'm proud of you. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that supporting you meant celebrating your independence, not trying to control it. I read the letter several times, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was relief at finally receiving some acknowledgement of the pain Emma had caused me. There was sadness about all the time and connection we had lost. There was wariness about whether this apparent insight represented genuine change or just another form of manipulation. But there was also something like hope, not hope that we could return to our old relationship, which had been unhealthy for both of us, but hope that we might eventually build something new and better. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. Instead, I took it to my next therapy session with Dr. Kim to process my reactions and consider my options. This seems like genuine remorse, Dr. Kim observed after reading the letter. But remorse is just the beginning. The question is whether Emma is prepared to do the work of building a new kind of relationship with you, one based on mutual respect and reciprocity. We talked about what that might look like, Emma showing genuine interest in my life and activities, Emma offering emotional support without strings attached, Emma respecting my decisions even when she disagreed with them, Emma contributing to our relationship rather than just taking from it. You don't have to decide right now whether to trust her again, Dr. Kim reminded me. You can take things very slowly and see whether her actions match her words over time. I ultimately decided to send a brief response to Emma's letter. I thanked her for the honesty and courage it had taken to write it. I told her I appreciated her acknowledgement of the problems in our relationship and her recognition of my growth and independence. But I also made it clear that words alone couldn't repair the damage that had been done, and that any future relationship between us would need to be built gradually, based on consistent demonstrations of the respect and care she described in her letter. I'm open to the possibility of rebuilding our relationship, I wrote. But it will have to be a different kind of relationship than what we had before, one where we both give and both receive, where my autonomy is respected, and where I'm valued for who I am rather than what I can provide. Emma's response came quickly and surprised me with its humility. She agreed to my conditions and asked if we could start with occasional phone calls where she would simply ask about my life and listen without offering advice or making requests. Those phone calls, when they began a few weeks later, were awkward at first. Emma seemed genuinely uncertain about how to have a conversation with me that wasn't centered around problems to be solved or resources to be accessed. I was cautious, waiting for the familiar patterns to reassert themselves. But gradually, something different began to emerge. Emma asked about my painting and listened to my descriptions of techniques I was learning without suggesting that I was wasting time or money. She inquired about my book club selections and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about the stories we were reading. Most surprisingly, she began sharing details about her own life that weren't requests for support or advice, stories about challenges at work, concerns about parenting decisions, observations about changes in her marriage as she and David adjusted to different stages of their lives. It wasn't the easy, warm relationship I had once imagined we might have. There were still moments of tension, still echoes of old patterns, still wariness on both sides. But it felt honest in a way our relationship hadn't felt in years. The real test came 6 months later when Emma asked if she could visit me for an afternoon. She wanted to see my paintings and meet some of the friends I had been telling her about. I was nervous about the visit, unsure whether Emma's apparent changes would hold up to face-to-face interaction. But the afternoon went well. Emma was respectful in my space, complimentary about my artwork without being condescending, and gracious with the neighbors who stopped by to meet her. Most importantly, she didn't make any requests, for money, for changes in how I was living, for special consideration or access. She seemed to genuinely be visiting because she wanted to spend time with me and learn more about my life. As she was preparing to leave, Emma paused at my front door and said something that nearly brought me to tears. "Mom, I'm really sorry about what happened between us. I'm sorry it took me so long to see how wonderful and capable and interesting you are. I wasted a lot of years treating you like a burden when I should have been celebrating you." It wasn't a complete healing. Relationships don't recover from years of damage through single conversations or gestures. But it was a beginning, and it was genuine. Now, 2 years after that terrible day when Emma announced that my home was no longer mine, I can say that my life is fuller and more satisfying than it has been in decades. I have a community of friends who value me for who I am. I have creative pursuits that challenge and fulfill me. I have a sense of autonomy and self-worth that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or need for my services. My relationship with Emma is still a work in progress. We talk every few weeks, and our conversations are more honest and reciprocal than they used to be. She visits occasionally, and I've begun to trust that her interest in my life is genuine rather than strategic. She still has work to do on understanding boundaries and reciprocity, and I still have work to do on trusting her intentions, but we're both trying. More importantly, I've learned that my well-being and happiness don't depend on whether Emma ever becomes the daughter I hoped she would be. I've built a life that sustains and nurtures me independent of her choices or behavior. If she continues to grow and change, wonderful. If not, I'll be sad but I won't be devastated, because I'm no longer dependent on her love for my sense of self-worth. The other day, I was hanging a new painting in my living room, an abstract piece filled with warm yellows and oranges that somehow captures the feeling of sunrise after a long, dark night. As I stepped back to admire it, I caught sight of myself in the small mirror by my front door. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had stood in that same spot 3 years ago, clutching Samuel's photograph and reeling from Emma's casual announcement about my home. This woman stood straighter, smiled more readily, wore colors that reflected joy rather than resignation. This woman had learned that it was possible to love someone deeply while still protecting herself from their capacity to cause harm. She had learned that relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care were possible at any age. She had learned that it was never too late to discover new talents, form new friendships, or create a life that reflected her own values and desires rather than everyone else's expectations. Most importantly, she had learned that her worth wasn't determined by how much she could give to others, but by the fullness of her own experience, the depth of her own growth, and the authenticity of her own choices. Standing there in my peaceful apartment, surrounded by my paintings and my books and the comfortable evidence of a life well lived on my own terms, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete contentment with my own company. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reverie. It was Mrs. Martinez, stopping by to share cookies from her granddaughter's baking experiments and to chat about our plans for the community garden we were helping to organize in the small lot behind our building. As we sat at my kitchen table, laughing about the challenges of convincing city bureaucrats to approve our garden plans, I thought about how different this scene was from the lonely silences that had filled my days before I learned to value myself as much as I had always valued others. I thought about all the women in my support group who were still struggling to set boundaries with difficult adult children, still learning to distinguish between love and enabling, still building the courage to prioritize their own well-being alongside their care for others. I thought about Emma, who was slowly learning to see me as a person rather than a function, and who was discovering that relationships based on mutual respect were more satisfying than ones based on power and control. And I thought about you, listening to my story, perhaps recognizing patterns in your own life, perhaps feeling the familiar knot of anxiety that comes from loving someone who takes more than they give. Have you ever lived something like this? Have you ever found yourself giving to family members who seem to see your generosity as weakness, your love as something they can exploit without consequence? Have you ever wondered when your children stopped seeing you as a person deserving respect and started seeing you as a resource to be managed? I want you to know that it's never too late to change the dynamic. It's never too late to set boundaries, to prioritize your own well-being, to demand the respect you've earned through decades of love and sacrifice. It won't be easy. The people who have benefited from your endless giving may resist your transformation. They may accuse you of being selfish, difficult, or mentally unstable. They may escalate their demands or their emotional manipulation when their usual tactics stop working. But on the other side of that resistance is a life where you matter, where your needs count, where your happiness is valued by people who genuinely care about you rather than just what you can do for them. You deserve relationships that nourish you as much as you nourish others. You deserve to wake up excited about your day rather than anxious about what others might demand of you. You deserve to discover who you are beyond your roles as caretaker, supporter, and financial resource. You deserve to paint your own sunrise after whatever long, dark night you've been enduring. If this story resonated with you, please share it in the comments below. Tell me about your own journey toward self-worth and healthy boundaries. Let others know they're not alone in struggling with these painful family dynamics. And if you found hope or recognition in my words, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. Your support helps stories like mine reach other people who need to hear them, other people who are learning that it's possible to love deeply while still protecting themselves, other people who are discovering that they have value beyond what they can give to others. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for our children is to stop enabling their selfishness and start modeling self-respect. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our families is the example of a person who refuses to be diminished, who insists on being valued, who creates a life filled with purpose and joy regardless of whether others choose to participate respectfully. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing me not as a cautionary tale or a victim, but as a woman who found her way from darkness into light, who learned that it's never too late to bloom, who discovered that the most important love affair of her life would be the one she finally had with herself. The sunrise I painted is hanging on my wall now, a daily reminder that even the longest nights eventually end, and that we always have the power to choose what kind of light we want to create in the world.